Hi there. This is Edgar Allan Poe taking over the body of James Valvis to produce incredible wisdom here on the internet for you. And if any stupidity falls into this conversation, it's because I have not completely taken over the mind of Valvis yet, and some of his error slips in. Today I want to talk about compassion. Compassion. We spend a lot of time talking about compassion these days. Each side believes that they are the compassionate side. Each religion believes that they're the compassionate religion. Each group and subgroup believes they're more compassionate than the other group. People will be extremely violent in the name of being compassionate. It's very odd, but you'll have somebody throw a brick through a window in the name of compassion. Or they'll beat somebody or pepper spray somebody in the name of compassion. As that famous philosopher Bono once said, "In the name of love, what more in the name of love?" But it's not love so much that gets the press these days, but compassion. And what do we mean by compassion? Usually compassion means that you feel pity for the other, usually the lesser. So, right away you're running into a problem with the emotion. Now, let's be clear. No emotion, whether we consider them positive emotions or negative emotions, are bad in and of themselves. They're only bad when they are not aligned with the good, or when they go to the extremes. We'll get to this in a minute. Compassion, though, suffers from the problem in that you automatically are able to elevate yourself over the other person that you're feeling compassionate toward. In other words, it's an ego boost. It's an ego trip. If I'm pitying you, then that means I'm at a higher level of attainment or happiness or whatever else than you are. If your marriage is going badly and my marriage is going well, then I can pity you and feel compassionate toward you, but I'm doing so from a place of superiority. Even if my marriage is going poorly, then at least I say to myself, well, things may be going badly for me, but they're also going badly for this person. And therefore, the compassion again lifts me up from a place where I'm debased to a place where I'm equal. Now that's important. That's important because if you're looking out at the world and feeling compassionate all the time, that means you can always lift yourself up over other people. And if you can do that, then you never have to lift yourself up. All you have to do is feel compassionate for other people or toward other people. This is some of the psychology that goes into it. Now, compassion feeds the political discourse more than any other emotion you can think of. The left is saturated with the rhetoric of compassion. Their entire philosophy, their entire political agenda is built around this emotion. And of course, since I've already explained, it builds up the ego. Guess what happens to the political left? They become very, almost narcissistically self-possessed in their self-satisfaction. Before we go on, there's a couple of things that we need to understand about ethics. And the first thing that we need to understand is what Aristotle called virtue within the means. Now, what that means is he believed, and I think it's very sound, reasonable thinking, that all virtue exists in the mean. It doesn't exist in the extremes. I'll give you an example of this, a very easy example of it. Let's take bravery. Let's take courage is the virtue. Okay? Now, if you have too little courage, we all know what that means. That means you're a coward. Of course, nobody thinks of a coward as a virtuous person. We think of a coward as somebody who's lacking virtue, lacking the virtue of courage. And we say to ourselves, wow, this person needs to buck up and become more courageous. If a person sees somebody in deep trouble and walks away, say a little girl is screaming for help in an alley as two thugs beat her up, and some guy sees it and he gets afraid and he walks away, we don't mistake that person for courage as courageous. We don't award him that virtue. But here's the mistake that people make. That's not the only failing in courage that you can have. A while back, when right after 9/11, Bill Maher, the famous comedian and atheist, was on his show. I forget the name of it at the moment, but it was something like Politically Incorrect. That might have been the name of it. And he said that he thought that the 9/11 terrorists were courageous. Well, this created an enormous backlash against him. It was right, emotions were running high then, and people complained to the network that his show was on. He got canceled because of it. He got thrown off his show, which is a terrible miscarriage of justice, by the way. A person should be able to have an opinion, even if it's wrong, and in this case, he is wrong. That's what free speech is about. But what he didn't understand was, and the reason why people got upset is because he was only half right. The 9/11 terrorists, it's true, they were not cowards. No one can say that a person who goes into battle in that way or becomes a martyr in that way, who knows that they're going to die, is a coward. They're not a coward, but there's another extreme there. If you go to the other side of courage, you find that there is the problem of recklessness. In recklessness, you are stupidly courageous. I'll give you an example of this that's clear. Say a teenager with a car full of friends decides that he's going to beat the train across the tracks. Regardless of whether he makes it or not, and many times he does not, that is not a courageous act. That is a reckless act. It is stupidly courageous. So on the one side, you have a person who lacks courage, and that's a coward. But on the other side, in the other extreme, you have a person who has too much or stupid courage, and that person is reckless. That is equally bad. They are both equally bad. This is what Aristotle means, that virtue is in the mean. It is in the middle. It is something that you don't have too much of, you don't have too little of. And usually when you find people in error, this isn't always the case, but usually you find that they have too much of something. And you find that rather than having too little, they have too much. Often they have too much because they're compensating for something else of which they have too little. If you have too little virtue of fidelity to your wife, you may have too much generosity toward her when it comes to giving her gifts. And the whole time you're cheating on her, but you're also buying her jewelry. She thinks that you're crazy about her and buying her all this wonderful stuff, but really that's not really a virtue. All you're doing is appeasing your conscience because you're doing this other act. Okay. So now we turn to C.S. Lewis. We talked a little bit about Aristotle and virtue within the mean. Now, C.S. Lewis, in his great and very short, I think it's like 90 pages, fantasy novel called The Great Divorce, introduces us. Well, let me explain to you the plot of this wonderful little philosophically dense novel. A man dies, goes to hell, and hell is not, Dante's hell with the inferno and people going around and eating their own dung and the rest of it. But it's just a kind of a dull gray thing that forever goes on and on, stretches outward and outward, and people move further and further away from the bus that will take them to heaven. This is not a hopeless kind of hell. This is a hell where you can possibly leave it, but you are less likely to as time goes on. So he gets on the bus and he goes up to heaven, and he finds all kinds of difficulties with people have all kinds of difficulties adjusting to hell, or they cannot get their souls right in order to move into heaven and become solid and become large. And one of the people that he sees there, and he overhears this conversation, is a woman who dedicated her whole entire life after her son died to the grief and the grieving of the son. And she says to him that she says to the person who's appointed to her to try to get her to get to heaven, to change her attitude towards this, that there is absolutely nothing more beautiful than mother love. And her love for her son was a perfect thing. And she cannot understand that her love for her son was a perverse thing. It had become a perverse thing. She had too much of it. And when he died, she took that grieving too far. She closed off her relationships to her husband and her other children, and she became and the grieving itself was not about so much the love of the child as the obsession with the love and the satisfaction that grieving brought her. And because of this, she was not able to get to heaven, or at least it appears that way. She will not be able to go forward in her journey toward heaven, because she has become corrupted by this idea that this emotion that she has, mother love, is perfect and is as good as the love of any any other love, or it's a perfect kind of feeling, but really she's just become intoxicated off it. And so we're left with this this idea that emotions can be taken too far. You can have too little of it, or you can have too much of it. And when we look at the political left today, what we often see is people who have taken their emotions too far. They're not necessarily bad emotions. There are no such thing as bad emotions. There are emotions that need greater degrees of guidance so that they'll be properly adjusted. Such as, lust is an example of that. If you do not guide lust in the proper way, it becomes a perverse thing, and it's a very dangerous thing if in its form. But in the proper form, which is desire, it can be a wonderful thing. But too little of it is a problem. Too much of it is a problem. As this is true of all things. So we turn back to compassion now. And we look at people who have taken compassion beyond all reason. Compassion where we no longer care about how deeply our country is in debt, or we no longer care about whether or not we have border security. The compassion is always meant to lift up a person's ego, but it is never, ever given any kind of check. So we see, it's always, and this is the way to check whether to make sure that you're dealing with compassion properly in a political context or in a social context. If that compassion in some way benefits you, whether it be politically or it helps you win an argument online or it does something of that sort. Say you hate Donald Trump and something happens that allows, this excessive compassion to come forward, and it just so happens to knock down Donald Trump, you should really question whether that's compassion, whether compassion is driving that particular belief, or your desire to attack Donald Trump. Those are not the same things. Those are not equals in your mind. Now, a good way to judge whether it's true compassion is it something that concerns you on a regular basis? Were you concerned about how people were treated at the border 10 years ago? If you were, then you might say, okay, yes, this has been a concern of mine for some time, and I would like to talk about this, and it's an opportunity to do so. But if you'd never thought about this issue prior to seeing a couple of fake pictures of kids in cages, or seeing other pictures that happened during the Obama administration, and you just see this as a chance to get Donald Trump, then you're not really living in compassion. That compassion is a false compassion. It is just there for your own personal profit, which in this case is a political profit. This is something that we all should understand about ourselves. We should all try to get our compassion properly aligned with real compassion, where we feel real compassion for people. And if you're a Christian like I am, you understand that compassion must start, not end, but must start with the people who oppose you, the people you disagree with, the people you don't even like, sometimes the people you despise. Those people have the first claim to your compassion. Now, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do, which is why I always tell people, you think being a Christian is easy? Try doing it sometimes. G.K. Chesterton once said, the Christian religion wasn't tried and found wanting. It was found difficult and never tried. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because it demands of you that you counterintuitively feel compassion for those people you'd least like to feel it for. And so whenever you see somebody talking about compassion in one breath and yet hate in another, you know you're not dealing with real compassion. Or if you're dealing with real compassion, you're dealing with a perverse, excited compassion. And it's usually temporary in nature. 6 months from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the very people who cared about these people in the cages will not care about those people at all. Not at all. They don't care about those people at all. Only in as much as they can benefit for themselves. And so we see in compassion what we see in all the emotions, that it can be overwrought, that it can be overdone. And this is not something that you would hear from most people, especially people on the political left, because they have stopped using rational arguments and they have appealed to emotion over and over again. And when you appeal to emotion, when emotion is the thing that's driving your political movements and driving your political success, and with that political success is your economic success, and that's all built into that. When you're driving people by emotion rather than thinking, then the emotions themselves become perverse. Even something that we normally think of as good, which is compassion, becomes perverse. This is something we all need to consider seriously on all topics. When you talk about welfare, or you talk about health care, or you talk about war and peace, or you talk about letting in immigrants, when you talk about just where a bathroom is placed, or how you talk to the counter lady at your local 7-Eleven. All of this stuff shows whether you are living in a true compassionate state, or whether you're living in a state of selfishness, in which that compassion is just a tool to benefit you. And if it's a tool to benefit you, then you're like the lady in The Great Divorce. The mother love was never really about the child. It wasn't about the death. It wasn't about any of that stuff. It was always about the mother. And if the child had not died, she would have found some other way to bring the world to pity her and to feel this great, oh, look at me, my child died. This kind, we actually have a psychosis known as by proxy syndrome, where women will kill their children so that they get attention, so they get pity, and to some degree, that's what we're seeing in the wider culture. People look for things to be upset about. They look for people to be compassionate towards. They will make up things to be compassionate towards if they don't have anything. They'll invent stuff. This is why you have hoaxes of racism on campuses. People pretending to be it so people can be outraged and shocked and show compassion toward minorities. But in point of fact, we know that a lot of this stuff doesn't happen. And yet we are constantly bombarded with this idea that everybody needs our compassion all the time. Well, sometimes people do need our compassion. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they need a good swift kick in the ass. That happens. I have a daughter, and let me tell you, sometimes compassion is the way to deal with her, and sometimes it's not. It really depends, doesn't it? And if you just show nothing but compassion, you're going to spoil that kid. And if you just show nothing but a lack of compassion, just a swift kick in the butt every time, you're going to ruin her that way. So again, we come back to Aristotle's virtues within the means. There's a balance. All life is a balance, says Mr. Miyagi. And he's right, especially when it comes to virtue. And so the next time you hear some some political person talking about how these people are not compassionate, or that person is not compassionate, or this person is, not virtuous in some ways, question that. Always question that. If they stand to profit in any way, you should really, really think that this is not necessarily being driven by true compassion. True compassion, when it's honest, doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need a profit. When I feel compassion for my daughter, I don't expect people to pat me on the back about it. If my daughter is sick and I need to tend to her for a while, I don't expect to get a profit out of that. Except for the fact that, I love her and I want her to do well in life and I want her to get better. But the personal profit out of that, nah, it's not happening. That's real compassion. And we do see that every day in our lives. We live in a great, wonderful country full of truly compassionate people. But this kind of compassion I'm talking about, this poisonous kind, this kind that takes compassion for perhaps minorities and turns it into cop hate, that's not really compassion. What that is political opportunism and political benefit. Maxine Waters is not a compassionate person. She talks the language of compassion, but she's not compassionate. If you think Hillary Clinton's more compassionate than Donald Trump, you're mistaken. She's not. Nobody who calls a quarter of the country irredeemable is compassionate. I would never call a quarter of the country irredeemable. I would hope that they all could be redeemed, but not Hillary. And so we look out into the future, and we hope that there's a greater understanding of what ethics means and how true compassion shows itself. And it doesn't really ever show itself in a governmental sense. That's almost never the case. When they approached Scrooge, I'm talking about the two people who wanted Scrooge to give a little money to charity during Christmas time. They said to him, will you give a little money? And he said, well, aren't there government programs for these people? And they said, yeah, there are government programs. They don't do a lot, but they exist still. I wish they weren't. Some of them are pretty bad. And Scrooge says, well, good. I give it to them. You see, Scrooge is not really compassionate. He doesn't really care about the poor, at least not at that point. But he is progressive. He supports the progressive poor law, but in no way is he compassionate. Anyway, I hope you found value in this discussion. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share this talk. And as always, and most especially, God bless you.